So the specific topic here is getting the timing right for trending topics. And, it's all kind of based off this quote here by Victor Hugo. And nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And it definitely feels really powerful right now. If any of you guys are in the AI GPT-3, ChatGPT, Midjourney, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion kind of world, it really feels like the time has come for that idea. And actually, this image was made by AI for my book. It's one of the illustrations I use in the book. I'm not an artist, but it kind of looked cool to me. How do you get ahead of these ideas? Because it's incredibly valuable to know what's up and coming, and to understand which ideas are worth your time and investment. One of the benefits of being ahead of the curve is that you get a ton of backlinks, and backlinks are still really what drives SEO. If you're like Brian Dean and you coined a new term in SEO, right? He invented the skyscraper technique. Now every single person who writes about the skyscraper technique has to link to Brian Dean, right? Similarly, if you write about a topic that then suddenly becomes trending, then every news organization is going to have to kind of link to you to kind of point out that, oh, these guys came up with the idea, or like these guys have a specific asset or a specific article that you should read. So being slightly ahead of the curve is really important. But obviously, once that moment has passed, you kind of lose it forever. This is one of the rare occasions where I have gotten it right. So I was part of this team at Canada. It was actually a pretty small team, just 3 of us. And we wrote this Who's Freezing Hiring from Coronavirus page. It was actually a database that we built on Airtable. We got over 7,000 submissions in the space of 9 hours, which is pretty insane. I think Airtable said at one point we had the highest velocity of new database entries, which is really nuts. We stayed up all night on the weekend, answering these queries, because basically, we'd hit upon a trend. Loads of companies had suddenly started to freeze hiring. Like interns were getting told that jobs that had been offered were actually being rescinded. So it was a crazy time for everyone. Nobody knew what was going on, and therefore anyone who had any information was suddenly put to the top of all of the rankings, right? We got over 2,000 backlinks just in a very short space of time, that weekend, but also over the next few weeks as people wrote up what happened and what's continued to happen and who's now kind of hiring again, etc. And you can see that made a huge difference to our SEO traffic, but it was kind of like a delayed effect. It's kind of embarrassing, but we were writing for months before we got really any traffic. We had at this point we had 35 articles on the site, and not we were getting a few hundred hits per article. It was really this huge injection of backlinks that made it possible for us to rank on the non-trending topics, like the things that were related to what we were trying to commercialize. So I think in general, when I zoomed out to think about what I was creating for this presentation, I realized that I kind of done this a couple of times. My whole career really is just a kind of a series of waves that I've ridden. The big one was the shift from advertising budget out of offline channels like newspapers, magazines, outdoor, into the internet. I started advertising around here. I won't date myself too much, but at the time, I remember people telling me the Google Ads campaigns that I thought were really important, spending millions of dollars a year, were actually a rounding error compared to what they were spending on TV. Now that is completely flipped, and digital is the majority of ad spend. Being part of that kind of trend really accelerated a lot of my career. I guess I have dated myself here. I started advertising in 2010. I quickly jumped on Facebook ads because, as you can see, I was kind of 10 years behind the curve here. even it was, I mean, still very valuable for me to be advertising in Google ads in 2010, 10 years after they came out. But with Facebook ads, it was a little bit closer, right? They came out in 2007. I started testing them in 2011. And I took a job specifically that allowed me to spend more money on Facebook ads. Then growth hacking came and I spotted my opportunity. So I immediately started to learn about growth hacking. Brian Balfour, Noah Kagan, Ryan Holiday, like all these guys. I think Travis is nodding because I think we share a lot of we've read a lot of the same blog articles. But that term was coined in 2010 by Sean Ellis. And I actually, I pushed pretty hard and I managed to move into a growth role in 2012. I was actually called the product manager for marketing, which was like the closest my organization could get. That kind of was the most consequential wave that I rode. I started an agency that was a growth hacking agency, as Travis said. They were called Ladder, and we grew that to 50 people. So that was definitely the biggest wave. It made the biggest difference to my salary. But since I left Ladder, I've been trying to catch other waves. Marketing mix modeling was one of the ones that worked out. I got into that February 2020, and then iOS 14 happened in September 2021. And suddenly, an attribution method that didn't require cookie level data was incredibly important, right? So I was actually a little bit ahead of the curve there, and been able to triple my consulting rates since. Now, one of the waves I'm kind of trying to ride right now is AI. Actually, my book, I started writing it before AI came out, but then it's basically made a lot of the things in my book a lot more important and more interesting than they otherwise would have been. So I think that's been helpful. But I was playing around with the GPT-3 beta in July 2020. I remember trying to convince my wife, who is a copywriter, to use it, and she was like instead very horrified by the implications of what it would have for her. For her career. So a ChatGPT now is like 100 million users plus, and everyone's talking about it. But I already had blog posts in place. I already have been using it for a while and kind of built that foundational knowledge. So it's let me capitalize on it a little bit quicker. Cool. So, one thing though, you can't be too early. Being early is exactly the same as being wrong. One simple example that everyone always uses is pets.com. They went bankrupt after losing $82 million in 1998, which actually doesn't seem like that much, but at the time it was the biggest loss in the startup ecosystem. It popped the first dot-com bubble. But essentially exactly the same idea, Chewy, they managed to IPO at an $18 billion market cap in 2017. And there's a few different things that make the ecosystem ready for an idea. It's very hard to predict. Startups. One of the number one things that a VC will ask you is why now? Like what's specific about what's changed that makes this idea really good. The ones that have been in the game for a while will say that they've seen this idea 1,000 times. And maybe the 1,001 time is the best one to launch. It's very hard to know. Facebook wasn't the first social network. Google wasn't the first search engine. So it's really a case of kind of getting the timing right and kind of jumping in at the right time. Cool. So specifically to content, one thing you have to remember is that anyone who is a content creator is captured by their audience. They have to publish or perish. And this is one of the things they don't tell you in influencer school, right? Is once you start posting on Instagram, you're doomed to forever continue, right? Every single moment, you won't be able to enjoy because you have to turn it into postable content. It's the same thing for news organizations. They have the 24-hour news cycle. Everything, there's always has to be something happening, right? And sometimes there just isn't any news, and they have to manufacture something, right? So here's a really good example that I managed to find. This is from the election, the famous election where Trump, unexpectedly won. I think elections and sports games, different kind of breaking news events are really interesting to look at from this perspective, because you can kind of see when news suddenly happens, you can see the transition. So on the left here, you have Jeff from Franklin County, right? Small county here in Ohio. He was discussing the security of the new voting machines. It's just kind of a piece of filler content, right? Like this is Jeff's 5 minutes of fame, right? And he wouldn't normally get on the news, but it's the election. There's nothing actually happening at this point, so they're interviewing him. And then, just a few seconds into Jeff's spiel, then Hillary Clinton leaves her compound to head to Manhattan. It's not even that important of a news story, but it's enough to kind of switch attention. And they actually interrupted poor Jeff in order to show you just like some footage of Hillary leaving the compound, right? So I think it's really important to think about this dynamic. And this is actually something that I got from Nick Barron, he was the former head of SEO and PR at Grammarly. Like when I got in contact with him after we had this breakout success at Canada, because he was kind of an advisor or a friend of an advisor. He's the one actually I kind of need to credit for this filler versus killer interplay. So filler news, right? That's like where you can be, right? Like like when there's no actual breaking news, like you can insert yourself into the conversation. Like if you're Jeff, right, you can actually kind of get your 5 minutes of fame. And you can kind of tell if there's filler news going on when there's a lot of demand for a story, but there's not much supply, right? So there's a lot of demand for the election, but there wasn't much supply. So they had to kind of drum something up. Usually these are like human interest stories, could be celebrity gossip, lifestyle pieces, expert interviews, or pundit opinions. And then the killer news, like when something is breaking, it's very, very hard to insert yourself in the conversation, right? Killer news is anything that's urgent, relevant, significant to the audience. It could be like press releases, natural disasters, political events, sports games, economic reports. So this is kind of the way I think about it. Is there something happening or nothing happening? And then the thing that's happening, does it have broad appeal or does it have niche interest? So if something's happening, and that thing that's happening has broad appeal, that's breaking news. You're not going to get your brand message in there, right? Like you could write a blog post about it, but nobody's going to care. But if something is, if nothing is happening, then you can write something that has broad appeal, and then you become the filler content, right? So that's kind of what you want to think about is when can you pitch, when can you pitch a mainstream news organization? When can you pitch a guest post when they need to fill that gap in the 24-hour news cycle? There's another category which is also interesting, and I think it could be even bigger if done well, which is you might have a niche interest, right, that doesn't really have broad appeal, but like if something is happening that you could relate it to, then I think that's when you can kind of get your 5 minutes of fame, like Jeff, right? So his niche interest was, these voting machines that they just got in his county, but for you, if you're kind of startup that's launching a new product, think about like if something is happening in your category, how do you relate what you're doing to that specific topic? And getting the timing right is really about kind of figuring out what part of the cycle is going to be useful for achieving your goals. Usually something happens and then people jump on it, right? So then it becomes breaking news. There's a little bit of a lag, typically, right? Something will start trending on Twitter, and then the mainstream journalists will write about it. And newsjacking is kind of getting in between those two, right? So if you're the first, like if you're in that Twitter group and then you're the first one to write about it, then you have a chance of kind of, getting ahead and being cited as a source by more mainstream publications. Then eventually it kind of gets to the peak, and then it becomes like old news, and then nothing's happening anymore. And what most people don't really think about is that like newsjacking is very, very good for getting attention, but it's a terrible way to make money, right? It's not very commercially valuable, because you're too early actually to make money. Where you want to make money is if you're a consultant or if you sell a product, you actually kind of really want to sell after the peak. That's actually where all the money is to be made, because that's when mainstream companies or mainstream people are willing to pay to catch up, right? Because they're not ahead of the curve. Like Fortune 500 brands are only just now hearing about growth hacking, right? I actually had like a few leads come in where they're like, "Are you still offering growth hacking services?" And I'm like, "I haven't done that for 5 years." So like, but that's actually the best way to make a lot of money. You don't make a lot of money from working with startups, right? They don't have that much money to spend, and I think this is something that like people forget about. Like they don't really consider this. If you want status, then you're going to be early on topics, and if you want money, you've got to be a little bit late. So where do you find these things, right? There's a quote by Paul Graham that I'm just kind of paraphrasing, but he says that I think in one of his essays, he says you should live in the future and then build what's missing, right? So that's his advice for like come up with good startup ideas. And I think that with content, it's the same thing, right? If you live in the future, then you just kind of write what's missing. That's really how you can influence the influencers. That's really what journalists are doing. If you kind of trace the ancestry of the stories, you can kind of see like almost everything on BuzzFeed starts as a Reddit thread first, and then they just take like the most interesting posts and package them up in a more shareable format. Because Reddit is popular, but it's not that popular with the mainstream. Nobody mainstream really reads Reddit, right? It's more counterculture. It's the same thing with any creative pursuit. Like fashion designers will steal the looks and styles that they see on the street, right? From actually fashionable people who came up with those things themselves, right? DJs will they'll replicate the sounds that they hear in underground clubs, right? Like rock bands do the same. So think about where is the counterculture? Like where are the people who are living more authentically, like more realistically, like closer to reality, I guess is the best way to describe it. And then you just insert yourself in that conversation, and you just start to see things bubble up. And typically, I would say when you feel like it's you're almost like too late on the topic. Like if you are living in the future, that means you're actually just at the right time. So that's the topic that I had for you today, the trending topic. It's just one of many things I talk about in my book. The book is Marketing Memetics. It's about reverse engineering creativity. Obviously, reverse engineering the timing is one thing, but I also talk about how to figure out what copy is likely to work, what images are likely to work, what brand kind of attributes are likely to work as well. So hopefully that's interesting for you guys, and happy to stick around and answer as many questions as you'll throw at me.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, definitely looking forward to the book as well. Yeah, I had not heard that Paul Graham quote, but I do like that. Live in the future and build
Yeah.
what's missing. It's pretty
Yeah, I should
impactful.
have put that on the slide with like an inspirational picture behind or something.
Yeah.
I'll do that
Um,
for next time.
yeah, and then everybody, you can drop your questions in Q&A or just send them to me in chat. But we do have a couple to kind of kick it off. Do you use any tools to surface trends kind of on the rise?
Yeah, good question. No, I think actually tools are almost by definition like not good at doing that, right? Because tools need data, right? And you already need like you need like Ahrefs, for example, is a very good tool for checking how much traffic specific keywords would have, right? But they're terrible for trending topics because these keywords aren't like associated with anything interesting yet, right? Actually, like I still, even if I look at marketing mix modeling, I still don't really see a big trend in Google search trends. I still don't see the spike, but like I definitely felt it, right? Like I had a
Yeah.
huge amount of it. I actually had a Twitter post. I was just live tweeting a Facebook webinar on marketing mix modeling. It's a statistics webinar, right? You wouldn't expect like any traction, but I got 800,000 people reading the tweets, right? And so like,
More than the webinar.
yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah. So it's yeah, I actually, like, people from the webinar reach out and they were like, thanks so much, you did our job for us. Yeah, I managed to talk to the Facebook team that built it and stuff. But yeah, so it's yeah, I would say like by like most tools are specifically designed to tell you what's already popular. They're not that good at kind of predicting what will be popular in the future. I think that's still like, a very human task.
Yeah, yeah, that's one thing I was kind of thinking about when you were going through your talk is like Google Trends, of course, but then exploding topics, which is like ironically by Brian Dean, who you referenced.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I
Um,
mean, yeah, he obviously sees the value
yeah,
in solving that problem. But yeah, I mean, I think like, I mean, I talk about this in the book, but Memetics, like this kind of this method for like finding what ideas are going to evolve and what ideas are going to spread. That's still not like a undisputed science, right? Like it's not like it's very very hard to define, even define a topic. So like, when you get into the messy weeds of it, like everyone's view of a topic is different. Like if I say, I don't know, Batman is trending, like Batman means something different to you than it means to me, right? Like if you're a fan of the comics and I'm a fan of I've just seen the movies, right? Actually, even if I saw like the Christopher Nolan movies and so someone else saw the latest movie, like we're all going to have a completely different definition and vision of like what Batman means. So like you can't just do a keyword search for Batman and just tell that like that is trending, right? It's like too nuanced.
good point. Like Twitter Trends is probably the best example of that. And you kind of click in and you see all kinds of questions and not sure why things are trending. Um,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it almost never seems to make any sense to me when I
no.
click through. Yeah, yeah.
Sarah sent in a question. She says, how would you translate this into writing stories? Like, how do you find and
Mm.
write about those topics before they peak?
Yeah, good question. So I think with newsjacking, like so like, going back to this diagram, um, so I think this is specifically for like trending topics, right? So that means something happened and then like this shifted everyone's vibe, right? They something has changed about the world and therefore it's news. I would say like I think that's like more obvious in terms of if you're enveloped in a space, like if you like I was a agency owner, right? So I knew that being able to attribute marketing budget was like very important, and marketing attribution was like a very difficult topic. So I knew that like if anything came around that helped you do marketing attribution, like that would be a big news story, right? Because I felt the pain myself. I think that like that so like that doesn't help you necessarily with the timing, but like if you kind of see this see something developing in the space, then that's when you start to jump on it. I think it is hard to get the timing right specifically, because quite often these things will just fizzle out, right? Or they'll come back again in the future. So that's why I do think you kind of need to keep your ear to the ground. You need to kind of make low cost bets, I guess, on like whether that will become a thing, and then double down. So with AI, for example, I think I wrote like one blog post about it. I started tweeting about it a little bit, and then more recently it's become like a much bigger thing. So I've now I just taught a course for O'Reilly on prompt engineering. I have like multiple blog posts about it. I've included AI in my book, right? Like I think your commitment is what you scale up and down once you see that you've gotten the timing right.
Nice. Yeah, that's super helpful. Um, and then some people might already be thinking this, but it's like how and should you manufacture trends? It's
Yeah.
like especially like B2B SaaS, a lot of people are thinking about category creation.
Yeah.
Drift's a great example of this. You have like pink pants on TikTok from like 7 months ago.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's tough. Nobody really knows what makes something go viral. Quite often, it could be like something random that causes it. I think people in general are allergic to obviously manufactured trends, which is why it's so hard to do it, right? So I'd say, like, at the very least, it needs to come not from your brand. It needs to come from someone authentic in the space. So there's I'm reading a book right now in kind of a little bit of last minute research for my book, but it's called Narrative Economics. And they talk about this in related to like finance and like the economy, and it's kind of interesting. But one of the things that they say is that almost always, like, the same narratives come back again and again, except they're attached to a new celebrity, right? And that's usually what kind of launches it, right? So they talk about Bitcoin. Satoshi Nakamoto is like, he's not a real person, right? It's a pseudonym, but like that's this kind of celebrity attachment with Bitcoin, and kind of that mystery, I guess, kind of optimize the virality of the Bitcoin narrative, right? But like the narrative that we should have like independent financial system has actually been, as old as time. And I don't even remember the name of the previous guy, but there was a whole trend where we like the gold standard and things like that. Like, this has actually kind of come up multiple times in the past. Similar to to Bitcoin, like the whole trend of like the narrative, like people are like making money on Bitcoin and you're a fool for not investing in it, right? Like that has been used to sell financial products for centuries, right? So it's just usually a different kind of example, a different celebrity that's attached to it.
Nice. And then kind of going back, this might be the last question, but kind of going back to the diagram you have of the kind of trend timeline. And you
Yep.
dug into a little bit, but it's like, what's the business KPI for kind of trend jacking, and is it measurable, or is it more like brand awareness for kind of down the road initiatives?
Yeah, good question. So I think there are probably three different reasons to write content. Or at least three reasons why I write content. So one is kind of like evergreen content, which I think is probably the most valuable. So it's something that, if you can imagine multiple of these peaks, right? It's a topic that will keep happening again and again, right? So it's evergreen, it's perennial, and I would say that's really to kind of build like long-term traffic, and like that traffic is going to keep coming back in the future. I would say that's the type of content where, like, you're kind of writing in this space. The topic is already or the narrative is like already proved itself valuable, and it's going to keep happening again and again. Jeff Bezos has this quote where he's like, you shouldn't really be I'm not even going to try and do the quote off memory, but he basically says, like, you shouldn't really care about what's changing, you should care about what's staying the same, because that's what you can build a business off.
Ooh,
Yeah,
good.
so he, like, with Amazon, like, nobody is ever going to ask for slower delivery, right? So if you can in the content, bringing that back to content, like if you could write about the equivalent of that, like something that like people always struggle with, then that content's going to kind of be a long-term asset, right? So I think that's one reason to write content. Another reason to write content is for things that don't necessarily have any search volume, but they will attract links. I think that's where newsjacking comes in. So links are status, links are authority, right? And if you can get ahead, like if you can build a reputation for being ahead of the game, then people will want to follow you, and they will be compelled to link to you because you are the original source that they learned it from, right? So I think like that's another reason to create content. And then the third is like for commercial gain, right? So you need some of your pieces that will like turn into leads, because like you have some like educational things that attract track traffic. You have some kind of status type, short-term things that will attract links. And then you need the third thing, which is like to convert all that traffic and authority into actual money, I write for a marketing attribution firm, and we've got one blog post which is like 8 tools for marketing attribution, right? Like it's very low traffic, but it's like a 10% conversion rate. So it's and like a lot of the rest of the strategy is kind of about building the authority and then kind of building the kind of regular visitors in the traffic and email list in order to be able to fully capitalize on those money terms.
Fantastic. Awesome. That's a good one to kind of wrap it up and end it with. Thank you so much, Mike, for your time today. I'll drop in Mike's Twitter handle if you want to give him a shout today and let him know how much you appreciate his talk. And then, Mike, do you have any last parting words?
Yeah, good question. I would say no matter how original you think you are, almost everything that you're writing about has been written about before. So if you do the research, you'll see that. And I think that's a really important part of being able to spot these trends.
Now, before we wrap this up, don't forget to share, like, and subscribe so you don't miss out on more great content from the industry's best SEOs, content marketers, and content strategists. The ClearScope webinar series happens every week and helps SEO content creators of all skill levels advance their knowledge. Hope to see you tune in next time.